but it amazes me.
Okay. Come down a little bit. Yeah. Okay, Bob, I'm sorry.
Well, Hitler was a madman. He was totally insane, but interestingly enough, I think he really believed in himself. He thought he could win the world. He thought he could take over the entire world. He really believed that. And everything he did was aimed in that direction. The question was, how do you stop him? Because he was sure that nobody could stop him. And if you just look at what happened, he didn't have too much opposition. He was doing a pretty good job. In fact, the people that were close to the whole war scene at the high command levels have said, and it's in the literature today, that if the war had lasted 2 or 3 weeks longer, he would have won it. He was that close to winning World War II. He didn't know it. His intelligence was amazingly poor. If he had better intelligence, he would have kept going, and he would have won World War II. But thank God he didn't. It was a pretty frightening situation. I don't think the average U.S. citizen realized how close we came to losing World War II. Darn near did. And Hitler was just poorly advised by his crew as to what was going on. If he'd known it, he could have wiped us out. He had a very, very good military organization, and he had some very good officers.
Was Nazism scary to you?
Didn't know much about it. It was just a criminal activity, a bunch of gangsters as far as we were concerned at that point in history. See, over 50 years, what we know about Nazism has been greatly amplified. In those days, he was a madman. He was just pleasing his own ego. He was going to clean up the world for his own purposes, and whether you called it Nazism or anything else, we didn't know much about it and heard much about it. In later years, yeah, we've zeroed in on what his logic was. But in those days, he was just a madman as far as we were concerned, and had to be stopped. And
okay. Can we tilt down just a touch? Oh, let's wait a second. We got somebody drinking over here.
Oh, the dog.
Yeah, you can hear him banging his license. To the Japanese doing their thing at Pearl Harbor, to that part of the war. What was your reaction?
Age has an awful lot to do with how you felt about anything. And when you're talking about something that happened 50 years ago, our personal viewpoint of it at that time and attitudes obviously was a lot different than it is now against the backdrop of what we know about what was going on. We really didn't know much about it. It annoyed us no end that the Japs had the audacity to come in and bomb Pearl Harbor. It didn't seem possible. But again, Pearl Harbor was a long ways from Los Angeles, and we didn't know personally anything about the place. I'd never been there. And so it was all kind of remote. The people who had families that were over there were much more deeply involved in what you're talking about here. But as far as we were concerned, our interest was totally focused on how do we wipe off from the face of the earth the whole German crowd and the whole Japanese crowd, and do it very effectively in one swat, and stop this pecking away of little groups at a time going in. You mentioned the Death March. My wife has an uncle who was in the Death March. And I knew him he was a very close friend of mine. And he, to the day he died, and he died only a couple of years ago, and he lived in Riverside, California. He'd spit in the face of any Jap that he ever saw. He had absolutely no feeling and respect whatsoever for Japanese. Now, in more recent years, younger generations, like the president we have now, are all preaching brotherly love with Japan. And all these trade agreements and everything else still goes down awfully hard with anybody that had anything to do with World War II. And I have friends here in Albuquerque who lived through World War II, and they're just furious about trade agreements, being nice to the Japanese. They want to kill them all today. They see no difference now than what they were during the war. But it's a different breed. The new breed, the youngsters have come in. They don't know what the World War was all about. And to them, why, sure, this is another country that we've got to live with. But the people that lived through the war, they just soon kill them all right now, today.
Okay.
So, two different communities.
I'm just waiting for this plane to pass. Okay. You say it annoyed you, the bombing. What does that mean? Could you describe that?
To think that these non-combatants were being killed in great numbers for no reason other than to please the ego of the Japanese government. They didn't represent any threat with the kinds of equipment that they had, the outdated equipment that they had. They did not represent any kind of a threat to the Japanese homeland. And never had we talked about that. We had trade problems, yes, with Japan, but this hatred business, complete distrust, really didn't exist. People weren't into it that deep. It was the war itself that generated all that viciousness that to this day exists. And probably always will, even though there are groups of people that are doing their best to talk it down. There's a lot of people that don't pay any attention to them.
Do you think it was kind of cowardly that they did a sneak attack?
Oh, definitely.
Did you say that?
Definitely cowardly. They did it knowing that we weren't doing anything to counter it. They knew that they'd come in there for free. Nobody was out there looking for them. They knew that they had a carte blanche to come into Hawaii without in any way being threatened by a counterattack from us. They knew that our military was asleep at the switch, and so they took advantage of it. And it was all over in a big hurry, and they profited by it. But they literally had no concern about being countered in that attack. It was really a sneak deal, and I'm astounded that it happened. I can't imagine such an incompetent U.S. military organization as we had at that time.
I was hoping you'd say that your response to the Japanese portion of it, not necessarily our incompetence, but just that they were cowards, or you would say, or that really made me mad. I was trying to get you to say something like
well, I have no personal basis to say that. That's the problem, you see.
Okay.
You got to remember my age. It has an awful lot to do with it. When we're talking about something that happened 50 years ago, your viewpoint of it today is completely different from what it was then. And we weren't close to those countries. We had an ocean all the way around us, and we literally lived in an ivory tower. We thought we were pretty independent. Isolationism was the rule of the day.
I was just wondering if if you had a comment on just what it's like the attack, that cowardly attack or something. We can move on.
Yeah. No, at my age, yes, I was angry at the whole darn thing, but I was pretty far removed from it. It had been going on for some time, but what we saw primarily was Japanese product coming in to interfere with our own product, and it was an economic thing more than it was more than a personal problem at the time. But of course, that all changed rapidly after they came in.
Yeah.
The audacity of them to come in and shell the Los Angeles beaches from a submarine absolutely surprised everybody. They figured, who in heck would ever do anything like that? Nobody believed it until the shells started coming in. And it was a token sort of a thing. They knew they didn't have any firepower, and they did it just to annoy us, just to really show what they could do when they wanted to.
Well, let's move on. Let's get back to Los Alamos.
All right.
Don't spend too much time out in those waters. Okay, so you got to Los Alamos. Who were you assigned to, and what was your job?
Kistiakovsky was the head man in the area that I was working in, and my job was twofold. It was to get on with the engineering part of the creation of the high explosive charges that were necessary to detonate the implosion bomb, the Nagasaki bomb, the number 2 bomb, which was a very complicated sort of a thing and highly problematical whether you could even do it or whether you could make it work. There were lots of questions as to whether it was a reasonable expenditure of effort. The other thing, the little boy, the gun gadget, was being handled strictly by Captain Parsons. A funny little anecdote about Parsons, when he arrived at Los Alamos, stopped at the guard gate after he climbed up the hill in the car he was in, and they took his papers, military transfer papers, and called up MP headquarters, and they said, hey, we got a guy down here we don't know what to do with. His papers read commander, he calls himself captain, and he's wearing a colonel's eagles. What do we do with the guy? I thought that was kind of cute. Here are these GIs that had never seen a Navy uniform or ranking uniform, and they couldn't understand a guy wearing eagles who called himself a captain, and these papers read commander. He'd just been promoted from commander to captain, and here, this confusion. They didn't know what to do about it. And they said, send him on up. Well, that's how Parsons arrived at Los Alamos, but I thought it was kind of a cute story. These GIs didn't know rank. They knew their own rank symbols, but they didn't know anything about the Navy's, and that confused them no end. Okay.
Kistiakovsky. Okay. What did they tell you? I mean, what did you know? I mean, did you know what the weapon was, or did you?
Kistiakovsky had pretty well brought me up to speed on what they were trying to do, and I talked quite a bit with this fellow Seth Niedermeyer, from a physicist from Caltech, in whose name all the patents have been registered for the implosion system. He's a very smart individual, but absolutely no management ability, and that's why Kistiakovsky was brought in from Harvard. Niedermeyer was put in charge originally of the explosives business, the implosion weapon business at Los Alamos at the start of the project. And he was assigned people, and he ignored them. He wouldn't give them anything to do. They just sit and try to amuse themselves. He was a one-man gang. He was that kind of a fellow. Individually very smart, but he had no ability to make use of the brains of other people. And so the project would just fell apart. And Oppenheimer realized what was happening, and so he had to remove Niedermeyer from the job and brought in George Kistiakovsky from Harvard, who had a reputation of being a very capable leader of people, organizer of people. And so Niedermeyer was assigned to Kisti, and he used him as a one-man gang, and then got on with his own people, and that's why he brought me in. Kistiakowsky could not live with Parsons, Captain Parsons. They came from different worlds. Parsons was Navy from way back, and to him a weapon was a gun. Anything else was not a weapon. And it drove Kisty absolutely insane because he was a physical chemist and highly scientific. And he was attempting to do something that Parsons way beyond him. He didn't believe in it, thought it was a total waste of effort. And so that led to Kisty talking to Oppenheimer and telling Oppie that he had to have his own engineering department. And that's how the two of them came to Berkeley to get me. And Lawrence had recommended to Oppenheimer that he thought he had the guy that could do the job, and that was me. That's how that all got going. The showdown on this implosion weapon came in Oppenheimer's office. He had a weekly meeting of the top staff, and by that I mean there's guys like Hans Bethe, Enrico Fermi, George Kistiakowsky, Johnny von Neumann, the head of the mathematics department. The top brass were about 7 or 8 of them of the laboratory, and these were all the foreigners that had come over here and started the whole business with Roosevelt and the rest of them. The Brain Trust. Oppie had these meetings every week, and it was a small group. And Kisty took me along with him to these things because there would be questions that came up in my field of expertise where he wanted me there to be able to defend myself or to put in my 2 bits worth. And because the guy that we were sparring with was Parsons. So then the famous meeting came up where Parsons sort of took over, and he says, Oppie, he says, I want you to put an end to the implosion weapon project, the thing that Kistiakowsky's working on. It's a total waste of time and money. There's no way on God's green earth that Kisty can ever get the molds necessary to produce those HE castings to the quality that are required in the time that's available. It can't be done. It's a total waste of effort. I want you to assign all of his technical staff to me to work on the gun project. Well, of course, Kisty got very furious about that, and I couldn't take it, so I spoke up, and I said, Oppie, that's not true. I know how to build those molds, and I know where to get the help to do it. And, of course, General Groves was sitting against the wall, which is what he always did. He'd tilt a chair up against the wall and just listen to the fight. And so Oppie looked at me, he said, do you know what you're talking about? And I says, I sure do. So there's only one place in the United States where I can get the help that I need to build those molds in the quantities that are required, and that's the Chrysler Corporation in Detroit. And at that time it was headed by K.T. Keller. And of course Groves knew everybody. He was working with big business across the United States. He knew the president of General Motors, president of Ford, president of everybody. So he perked up his ears in a big hurry, and he said, Bob, he says, are you sure you know what you're talking about? And I says, I sure do. And I know he's got the facility to do it, and the machine is called the Kellermatic, and it is the granddaddy of things we'll see many more of as years go down the road. This is the first numerically controlled machining device the country has. And Chrysler has it. Nobody else has it right now. So Groves gets up and he walks out and talks to Oppenheimer's secretary, Hazel Greenbacher. And he says, Hazel, will you get me K.T. Keller, Chrysler Corporation in Detroit? And so she gets on the pipe and calls him, and Groves says, KT, this is Leslie Groves. And they knew each other, and he says, I got a problem that I'm told you're the one guy in the United States who can help us on right now, and we need immediate help. I want to come in and talk to you, like tomorrow morning. And Keller says, well, okay, I can't talk about any more of it now, but he says, come on in first thing tomorrow morning, and we'll talk about it. So then Groves came back in the room where I was, and he says, Bob, can you be ready to leave with me in 2 hours? And I said, yep. There's shorter ones. There is one that covers... Oh.
Okay, so I want to... let me just back up a little bit before we get lost. What were you thinking about sitting in that car, driving that road up to Los Alamos?
Just what I'm going to talk about. There were no highways, freeways, or anything like that. It was just back roads to get from Albuquerque to Santa Fe. And so we wended our way through Bernalillo and Algodones and on up to Santa Fe, and then out of there through the Tesuque area. And these were very elementary kinds of roads. And we were talking a little bit, but we were kind of tired after the whole day that we'd already spent. So there were some long lapses when we were just practically ready to go to sleep if we had the chance. But we finally got up the hill to Los Alamos, where we got involved with the MPs and got over to Fuller Lodge. I never expected that I would be there for any length of time on this particular trip, but it was quite clear after a day or two that I was there for a while. And finally collected my wife and I put her on a train to go by train to Lamy below Santa Fe, and then I drove and then picked her up off the train and the baby to drive up to Los Alamos. Now, Los Alamos itself was a typical Army camp, two-story, four-unit apartment buildings built out of green plasterboard among the pine trees all over the place. And this was the housing for the families. The single people lived in dormitory-type buildings that were scattered. There was one big one down near Fuller Lodge, but there were others that were on out nearer the mountains. And of course, all the GIs and the WACs all lived in those barracks buildings. It was a military installation, and a lot of people don't realize that. It was strictly military. Everybody was in uniform except this cadre of civilians who were running the laboratory under Oppenheimer. And this led to some interesting discussions, I'll call them, between Oppenheimer and the commanding officer of the base, who was a colonel, Corps of Engineers colonel. And I had already mentioned the long hours, or the strange hours, that we kept in the laboratory, both in Berkeley and Los Alamos was the same way. You just went home when you got tired, and you ate when you needed to eat. Well, these GIs who were assigned around to work with the civilian scientists and engineers, and this was an interesting arrangement. These were very bright young lads. They were all engineering graduates. They had their military assignment deferred while they were in school, but once they got their diplomas, boy, they were fodder for the draft, and they got picked up right away, and were all shipped off to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, as a sort of a marshalling yard where they collected these young graduates and decided how to divide them up and how to quantify them so that they could tell the laboratories what kinds of guys they had available. So a great number of them were shipped to Los Alamos. Same way with wax. There were a lot of wax up at Los Alamos, and they were in all kinds of jobs, from computing jobs, mathematicians, to secretarial jobs. The medical facilities at Los Alamos were all Army, and the nurses were all Army nurses, and they were an interesting crew, strictly Army nurses, and a real fun group. They were a pool of the best babysitters we had available up there. Lots of these gals wanted to get out of the hospital, get out of the barracks, and they were just delighted to come over to the house and do babysitting jobs, and they were a fun group to talk to. Well,
can I back up just a little bit?
Yeah.
These engineering guys, I know they had an acronym. It was SEDs. Can you tell me that?
The SED acronym was Special Engineer Detachment, which was a part of the Manhattan District. Don't ask me where the name ever came from, but they were known as SEDs. And they were all kinds of ranks, from buck privates on up through master sergeants. Strange thing about them, some of them had doctor's degrees, and they might be working for a buck private, but nobody worried about these things. Totally nobody paid any attention to rank at any of these laboratories, either in Berkeley or at Los Alamos. You had people of all kinds of backgrounds and all kinds of salary level in the civilian area when they came into the business, and nobody paid any attention to it. They had an arrangement by which they could pay you, continue to pay you, what you could prove was your income that would be denied to you as a civilian if you worked for the project, for the Manhattan District. There'd be no salary increases or anything like that, but they could refund you. They could give you whatever you were going to lose by associating with the Manhattan District. That was a very interesting deal, because that led to people who were very wealthy working for buck privates that didn't have two nickels to rub together. But nobody worried about it. There was a war going on, and I think it was delightful. There was no friction because of that strange structure.
Okay, let's stop for a second. Because really important to this and what you were doing, there was a war on. It's almost like 50 years, it's almost 50 years now.
Yeah, it is.
People forgot that there was a war, and that you guys were there to win the war. Could you tell me a little bit about the spirit up there, about what you...
Yeah. There really was a war going on, and I got to make one earlier reference about it. In my last days in Hollywood, this was around Pearl Harbor Day, all civilian aircraft, airlines coming into Los Angeles, all the curtains were pulled, all the lights turned out. The airplanes came in dark so that they were not visible from the ground. The city was blacked out. The headlights on all the automobiles were blacked out. You had visors down over the lenses of your headlights, so it gave you enough illumination that you could avoid hitting fire plugs and stuff like that. But you were driving black everywhere. And the same was true in Berkeley, and the same was true in Los Alamos. Everything was blacked out at night. There was excitement in Hollywood one night when anti-aircraft fire began to be heard all over the place, and searchlights were sweeping the skies down near the beaches below, down near the Los Angeles airport. And these bursting shells up there, and everybody wondered what was going on. And we found out later that a Japanese submarine had cruised down the coast, and there were a lot of oil refineries right along the coast, right by the Los Angeles airport, and they were shelling the oil refineries from the submarines. And all this excitement, I don't think it produced any results, but it sure shook up the citizens of Los Angeles to be that close to a shooting war. Searchlights in the air and shells bursting overhead, and you realized there was a war going on.
What did you think about the bombing of Pearl Harbor?
Absolutely disgusting. I could not believe that our military could be so dead on its feet, that big naval force from Japan could get all the way to Hawaii, which was many thousands of miles, without being detected. And all the military officers in charge of that operation got court-martialed for it, and they should have been. They were totally asleep at the switch. And Pearl Harbor never should have happened. There was no reason for it to happen except complete negligence on part of the military command that were running the Navy and the Army installations there.
Were you outraged by the attack?
Yes, I was, very much so. I could not believe that they could have ever gotten that close to a target without being detected. And knowing what they had accomplished with that attack was absolutely devastating. It just unbelievable, the damage that they did there. I don't know to this day how they ever got in there without being detected, except through pure negligence on the part of the military high command, for which they were summarily court-martialed.
I still want to root around on here a little bit more because I want to try to set some of the stage.
Good.
What did you think about being at war? What did that mean to you?
Well, we knew there was a war going on in Europe, and had been for quite some time, but for us in Los Angeles to suddenly be involved in a war, have it right close to us, really woke us up. We realized that people weren't fooling around, that this was for real, and we had better change our whole way of life and take this whole thing seriously. We had known because of the rationing systems and everything else that we were being deprived of things that we had normally taken for granted in other life before the war. And now we really began to realize that nobody was fooling around. This was for real. And we, at Los Alamos, there was no, we realized thoroughly there that we were at war. We knew what we were doing. And the people around there, because of all the explosions that were going on in our test work, they knew that whatever was happening, why, it was something to do with high explosives, but they didn't know any details at all as to what was going on. And, but it had to be high explosives.
I'm going to back up a little bit. What did Bob Henderson think of Adolf Hitler? And the Nazis and that.
Yeah. How are you going to fit this in? I don't know. But when I was working with the Standard Oil Company in San Francisco, after I graduated in 1937, in May of 1937, and went to work for Standard Oil immediately over in San Francisco in their general engineering offices, where I was involved in high pressure vessel and piping design and furnaces and all that stuff associated with refineries, building this hydrogenation plant across the bay from San Francisco in Richmond. This was a unique process. It was a German process developed by IG Farben Industry. There was only one plant in the United States of that design, and it was at Bayonne, New Jersey. Again, Standard Oil. And we had borrowed 2 or 3 engineers from the Bayonne refinery to come out and to oversee our design work in San Francisco for the hydrogenation plant we were building there, or getting ready to build. The thing that began to annoy me was that I'd spent all day long converting Reichsmarks to dollars, and converting third angle projection to first angle projection drawings. Now, this probably doesn't mean much to most people, but the Europeans have a drafting system which is different from the United States. You look at a drawing that comes off of a European drafting table, and it's like you're looking through a mirror at the back side of the drawing. It's a very confusing sort of a thing. They're used to it, we are not, and we had to convert those German designs to an American system so that our laborers could build a refinery with drawings that they understood. They didn't understand the German drawings. Well, as I say, I was busy converting German drawings to an American system and converting Reichmarks to dollars, and I got madder and madder and madder. I got so I couldn't live with myself. I was young and impressionable, just a young graduate right out of engineering school. I finally went to the chief engineer and I says, look, I've got to resign. I can no longer work for this company. Now you got to remember, Standard Oil is Rockefeller. And of all the rotten families that ever existed, the early Rockefeller family, although they ended up by giving a lot of money to museums and things like that, during those years, they were just as rotten as they come. And here, every drop of avgas that Standard Oil was producing at our new refinery over at Bahrain Island in the Persian Gulf, every drop of that avgas was going to Hitler. And here I was working in San Francisco to design a plant, and I was doing nothing but working all day long for Hitler. And I got so mad, I went to the chief engineer and says, look, I can't take it. I got to get out of here. And he says, I can understand it, Bob. He says, you're just not suited to the oil industry. What you're looking at is the real oil industry. It works worldwide, and it pays no attention to politics. And we work with the Germans just as much as we work with anybody else. And so if you can't take it, why, goodbye. So I went to Los Angeles without any leads at all on how the heck to make a living. I just could not live with my conscience and do what I was doing all day long and read what I was reading in the magazines and newspapers at night. It was rotten. So I went to Los Angeles, and I went to the employment office at USC, University of Southern California.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
I wanted to hear Bob Henderson tell me what he thought of Hitler and the Nazis. And I was gonna
Okay.
ask you, I mean,
It's hard to know how to describe what we thought of him. Remember, I was very young. I was right out of college. And yes, we had read a lot about what was going on in Europe and a lot of stories about how the Jews were being persecuted and mass slaughters that were going on. But it was clear across the ocean. And the ocean was a lot wider in those days mentally than it is nowadays. Now it's almost one world. But in those days, there was a great big body of water between the United States and Europe. And we heard about all these things, and we deplored it. We were dead set against it, and we were doing everything we could to put an end to it. We were thoroughly convinced in my job, in the nuclear weapons business, that this was the way to do it. That we could end this war, and end it very fast, if we could get our job done. Much faster than the job could be done any other way. And we were pretty disgusted with this island hopping business that the Navy was doing clear across the Western Pacific, one island after another, with terrific loss of life. And what was it going to accomplish? We had to get Japan, and we had to get it completely and in one swat. And we knew that the nuclear weapon was the way to do it if we could get a design. And so we were totally dedicated to wiping Japan off the face of the earth. And that was our mission. And so Hitler was just the beginning of that. Japan wasn't even in the war at this time, but as I say, when I was in Los Alamos, they were shelling us in our own hometown, and so we knew that it was coming, that the Japanese war was there. And December 1 was right then at that time, and
One of the
December
reasons
7th.
why I asked this question is the fact that